Is your Catholic faith incompatible with science? Some people think so. Stay tuned to learn if that is true or not.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex mundo lux est orta, cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa.
Welcome to the EWTN Theology Roundtable. I'm your host, Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN, and I'm joined today on the roundtable by some familiar faces, Father Joseph Mary Wolfe of our Franciscan Friars, and Noah Lett and David Gregson of EWTN's Theology Department. And we're here today to discuss a topic of some controversy and some confusion. Some controversy because obviously today we live in a world that's saturated with the victories of science and the progress of technology. And so this plays naturally and quite reasonably a significant part of our daily life. And so that's not controversial. But sometimes the church seems to be at odds with that technological and scientific development, whether it's on the issue of embryonic stem cell research or on the issue of what took place at the beginning of history, at the beginning of time, at the creation. And so the church is sometimes portrayed as an enemy of progress in science, not so much technology, but that as well, since that benefits also from the various scientific advances, especially in the biomedical sphere. So this is the issue we want to talk about today. Is the church really at odds with science? Now, I think it's important to realize that some of this controversy is created and is obviously created not by the church's true position on the role of science with respect to faith and theology, but rather by a certain degree of propaganda coming from interest centers in our culture, whether it's the media or academia or political parties or persons that wish to advance certain agendas. And so it is convenient for them to portray the church, which is the largest, you would say, moral authority opposing the misuse of science and technology, not just in the United States, but also around the world. So it's a natural part of the controversy regarding different subjects in our society. And unfortunately, this propaganda represents a kind of intolerance towards the church, and the church herself is accused of intolerance towards new ideas and progress. And we want to find out if this is true. We, of course, don't believe that it is. And I think, Father Joseph, that in many cases, if you mention something that the church is opposed to, embryonic stem cell research or some other area, the immediate response, maybe not by a person well versed in controversy with the church, but by the public is often, well, ever since Galileo is a representative example of the kind of lack of respect that the church has for scientific discovery.
Yes, and we could just briefly mention about Galileo that he wasn't completely without fault on his own part, but even if you conceded that situation, a question we can respond with is, what else? What else shows that the church is opposed to science? And any honest historian of science that looks at the history of science and its development comes to the conclusion of its indebtedness to the Catholic Church. And in fact, a lot of the fathers of different scientific disciplines were themselves Catholic priests. We can think, for example, of Nicholas Copernicus, or of Gregor Mendel, who was an Augustinian friar, the father of genetics, Father George Lemaitre, who was the founder of the theory of the expansion of the universe and the Big Bang theory. He just died in 1966. Father Nicholas Steno, the father of geology, Father Roger Boscovich, the father of modern atomic theory. And in fact, I looked on the internet, I put in priest scientists, and I was amazed at the length of that list.
I think I found the same thing, and it's incredible. I counted over 200 names of not people hidden away in laboratories, but notable scientists in different disciplines.
And the Jesuits, in fact, there are several craters on the moon, 35 craters on the moon named after Jesuit scientists and mathematicians. So the church has led the way in astronomy as well, and in fact continues its work in the astronomical field.
But there is this sort of idea which has been called the Black Legend, sort of like the Black Legend of the Inquisition, which the British created in their war with Spain in order to demonize the Spanish. And so there's likewise a Black Legend regarding the church and science that all sort of fits together and make people forget or not know about these kinds of things and think only of that one incident where there were mistakes clearly made on both sides of the equation.
That's right. So it's something that continues to be put forward, and you see that in modern discussions and modern literature, that this legend continues that demonizes the Catholic Church as being somehow against science, when if you look at, for example, monasticism, there were some 37,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe, and they really preserved civilization. They became the centers of civilization and education, of debate and dialogue on issues like this.
Yeah, you really have. There was a book written a number of years ago. This is not simply because I'm Irish, but how the Irish saved civilization, about how the Irish monks, after the barbarian invasions, brought the knowledge of the ancient, of not only of the Bible and theology and faith, but also of the Greek and Roman intellectual tradition, brought it back to Europe in the monasteries they founded at the same time that Benedict is spreading Benedictinism up from the south, and together these, in a sense, repollinated intellectually Europe, out of which grew not only the schools that the monasteries ran, but also the great universities of Bologna, the very first university, where the subject matter was not only law or philosophy and law, canon law and theology, but also was the seedbed for scientific future scientific discovery. At this time, science was treated almost as a division of philosophy, and during the late Middle Ages, that separation took place, and there was this acquisition of a unique scientific method that could be used for new discoveries, and we've seen the explosion of that in history. I think, of course, this is ancient propaganda, if you will, but touch a little bit on the current propaganda culture that we live in, which in a sense demonizes the church on this point.
I think the headlines will speak for themselves. In 2011, there was a headline in the USA Today College Edition: Catholic students struggle with, quote, outdated and inflexible traditions. The thing, they were emphasizing students who said that rather than the students who said the opposite in the article. Another one is, this is 2013, was Mother Teresa actually sort of a jerk? And they can get away with saying stuff like this despite the great good that she did, and they took issue with the fact that she told people that their suffering was valuable and not something that they should always think of as an evil that had no use at all. Another example is in 2013, an article was written that says the Pope Benedict's dangerous sex appeal. A woman had been raped and she had died afterwards, and this Western journalist is writing in New Delhi about how the Pope's message just recently before about how families should stay intact, about how we should have heterosexual sex and preserve sex for marriage, that message is one of the reasons why these men felt emboldened to do that. Just silly stuff. Another one is a media blackout of Catholic Church sex abuse audit. The message came out, this is 2013, that showed that last year there was all the claims made against priests were shown to be false, so there was no year in which there was any new revelations about any priests. But this should be good news, but of course it's not put out there, it's a blackout on it. A final one I would give is, the now deceased atheist, they had a t-shirt, Richard Dawkins' t-shirt says, "Religion, together we can find a cure." And got these big bright t-shirts people are supposed to wear as if religion is a kind of disease that has done no good, despite the kind of things that Father Joseph has said. We're all aware about how there's no support for abstinence, about how the church's position about the marriage traditional marriage against same-sex marriage has great value for society. All this is overlooked, no matter how scientifically rigorous is the information, because the goal is to demonize the church, to further an agenda, and to make the church no longer capable of having a voice in the hearts and minds of people.
There's a recent example of this I just saw a couple days ago where I think it was in Rockford, Illinois. There was a pro-life group. They have a bus that they go around and they talk to, they explain about life beginning at conception. Yes, they do show pictures of the unborn and things like this, which other people are dissatisfied when they're reminded of the humanity of the child in the womb. And somebody firebombed their bus, gutting it on the inside. And on that very day, in which the press could have been noting how this pro-life group's bus had been firebombed and asked the question, who would be firebombing this bus? What they did is they talked about a anti-pro-choice event that occurred a decade earlier. A decade earlier. Now that was news, a decade-old anti-choice act, and I'm using their language obviously, but it was not news that somebody was in real time, in our time, attacking the efforts of this pro-life group. And I think that shows a degree of intolerance, not just a lack of journalistic integrity, as it does. It's a lack of integrity on their part, but even a degree of intolerance that they would conceive, that this newspaper would conceive that an attack upon a pro-life group would not be considered newsworthy. It makes you think of that, was it Niebuhr or somebody who said, well, they came first for the homosexuals, then they came for the gypsies, then they came for the Catholics, and finally they came for us. That you wait until they're attacking you because when these other groups are not important. And that's really intolerance bordering on hatred. I think there's another element too that sort of contributes to this pot of propaganda, and that is there are indeed many scientists out there and intellectuals in different disciplines who are out front as part of, you might call, the new agnosticism or new atheism, whether it's a Richard Dawkins or a Stephen Hawking with his particular scientific theories, where they are making a positive effort, what you might have called, if this were the Soviet Union, militant atheism, in order to attack religion. And in the process, when it's a scientist involved, they're very often overreaching their discipline. And this is something I think we want to talk about today, and that is how it is possible to overreach one's area of expertise and study, how it is possible to work within one's area of expertise and study and reconcile the different disciplines, and why the church tries to do that. And I think that brings us then to our next consideration, David, and that is what the church is saying about how we can work within different disciplines that have different fields of knowledge, different methodologies, and yet as human beings, as persons, not as scientist, as philosopher or theologian, but as persons, we can bring that together and reconcile that.
Well, the church doesn't claim a monopoly on truth. Catholicism provides only the only complete view of the world and of man's place in it. But that doesn't mean that all other accounts are false, except as they contradict Christianity. This explains why the church has always been ready to absorb truths found in other systems of thought. Why? Because so far as they're based on reason, they're complementary to the faith and not contradictory. God is the author of truth wherever it's found.
So that would be the scientist who discovers true insofar as it is true.
Right.
The philosopher.
Exactly.
The sociologist.
Yes.
Whatever the discipline would be.
Right. If it's found to be true based on reason, then it can't be contradictory to the faith. It has to be complementary. The prime example of a reconciliation of theology with a system that seemed incompatible with it may be found in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Since the early days of the church, Christian philosophy had relied heavily on Plato and the Neoplatonists as an aid to theology. But then in the 12th century, certain works of Aristotle became available again in the West. They'd been preserved in the East and translated into Arabic, but in the 12th century they became available in Latin. Now, Aristotle was an admired authority in the area of philosophy, and so his works couldn't just be discarded, but they did seem somewhat incompatible with what the church teaches. And so, because of his authority, he was studied on his own merits, so to speak, and conclusions were drawn by some that a proposition could be true in philosophy even though false in theology, and vice versa. This was called the double truth theory. Thomas Aquinas rejected this notion. In his Summa Contra Gentiles, he wrote, "Although the truth of the Christian faith surpasses the capacity of the reason, nevertheless, that truth that the human reason is naturally endowed to know cannot be opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. For that with which the human reason is naturally endowed is clearly most true, so much so that it is impossible for us to think of such truths as false. Nor is it permissible to believe as false that which we hold by faith, since this is confirmed in a way that is so clearly divine. Since therefore only the false is opposed to the true, it is impossible that the truth of faith should be opposed to those principles that the human reason knows naturally." St. Thomas recognized and acknowledged what was true in the teaching of Aristotle, and he rejected what was false. He went so far as to replace the Neoplatonist philosophy as the handmaid of theology with Aristotelianism. And Pope Benedict summed up his achievement in his general audience of June 2nd, 2010. The Pope said, "In short, Thomas Aquinas demonstrated that a natural harmony exists between Christian faith and reason. This was Thomas's great achievement. In that moment of a clash between two cultures, a moment in which it seemed that faith would have to capitulate to reason, Thomas demonstrated that the two go together. What seemed to be reason incompatible with faith was not reason, and what seemed to be faith was not faith insofar as it was opposed to true rationality. Thus, he created a new synthesis which shaped culture throughout the following centuries." Reason on its own has made many discoveries. Science has discovered many truths about the universe, when it began, the particles from which it's constructed, about man, how he's constructed, how to treat disease. And philosophy has discovered truths about God. Both Plato and Aristotle concluded that there is a supreme God, and even some of his attributes. But knowledge based on reason is not enough. According to St. Thomas, reason alone can't discover all that is necessary for a man to know in order to be saved. Our destiny as human beings exceeds the power of reason to grasp. What exceeds the power of reason is revealed to faith in Scripture and apostolic tradition. St. Thomas writes, "It was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God, besides philosophical science built up by human reason. Firstly, indeed, because man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. But the end must first be known by men who are to direct their thoughts and actions to the end. Hence it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to him by divine revelation."
So we're basically saying then that there will be many areas of knowledge that one individual or even one group of individuals will not discover or is difficult to discover. And only by revealing, especially with regard to our ultimate destiny, is this securely known by everyone. And that this is the purpose then of revelation, that it brings that supreme knowledge, that ultimate knowledge of man's destiny and how to achieve it to the forefront. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll pick up that theme and talk about how we can integrate together these disciplines of philosophy, of science, and of theology or faith, and what they each can tell us about the truth.
Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex mundo lux est volta. Ave Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta.
Well, we're back, and we're going to talk a little bit now about the what would be three overarching areas of human knowledge: theology, which is based on the data of faith, what is given to us by divine revelation, which human beings then think about, or as St. Anselm put it, is faith seeking understanding. As we come to understand the faith, we develop new expressions of it that express it more clearly, more definitively, and so over time the theology builds up a body of doctrine, which is an expression of the faith. And so that's an important area. This is regarding things which we cannot necessarily innately know through human reason alone, regarding God, regarding the nature of salvation, and so on. We could say that it regards the ultimate causes of everything. That God made the universe, that He destined it for glory, that He created man in that universe and destined it for communion with Himself, and that because of the sin of man, there is a work of recreation going on, which was accomplished in Christ once for all, but yet is now distributed in its graces and in its effects throughout history until the end of the world, when the world is renewed. This is not something that reason could necessarily get at. It may see some elements of it, but not all of them. So religion, theology, faith gives us the ultimate cause and destiny of everything around us. But there are two other areas. There is the area of philosophy. Philosophy, although today I think if you took a typical college course on philosophy, it would seem like a very subjective thing that this is perhaps a little severe statement, but like it would be a glorified navel-gazing, sort of thinking around about stuff and not really coming to any really serious conclusions about the world, certainly not definite conclusions, and that each person can have their own philosophy of certainly. And there is a sense in which that's true. People collectively have a worldview which they've developed over time, and they try to live and follow that. That could be spoken of as their personal philosophy. But by philosophy, I mean the discipline which is trying by reason to get at these ultimate causes insofar as reason can get at them. And of course, as I noted, it needs theology, it needs faith, revelation to go securely beyond that and to see those things that are impenetrable to reason, such as God Himself. So historically, we certainly see, as David noted, that philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, they understood that there had to be an ultimate cause of all things, that the natural and material causes of the world around them that they saw couldn't explain how those things themselves came into effect and came into existence. And therefore, there had to be an ultimate cause beyond that, which was the source of all other causation, of natural causation. And so they posited that there was a supreme being who possessed self-existence, who possessed all act, infinite act, and so on. And so He could communicate act. He could cause effects outside of Himself, and therefore create the laws of the universe, the laws of nature, which then continue on to carry into effect that causation instituted and set going by God. And so this is what they discovered. Theology has given that God a name. And theology and Christian revelation certainly has gone ahead and shown that God is a communion of persons. And in that communion of persons, we are called into that, and so we learn much about what we ourselves are by knowing God. So we have these different disciplines: philosophy seeking the ultimate causes of things by reason, theology certainly revealing what God wishes us to know about himself and about our destiny and so on. We could think of it as the ultimate causes from that perspective, the ultimate cause being God himself. And then science, studying the natural causes, the material causes. But they're studying each thing, each area of study is something different. God, ultimate causation, natural or material causation. And they have a complementary character to them that needs to be fit together. And this is what the synthesis of the church did in the Middle Ages. And it did it with some defects. A good example of that defect would be with regarding the question of when human life begins. Thomas Aquinas, using the philosophical principles of Aristotle, which he perfected, looked at the question of human life and all life, and taking the scientific knowledge that was available regarding the stages of unborn life and sawing the different stages, which on one hand appeared simply as sort of sensitive life, and on another as animal life, and finally a human life, said that, well, the human soul was probably infused at the point at which it took the form of a man, basing it on those externals. And that was his conclusion based on the philosophical knowledge that he had. That conclusion was wrong because the science was wrong that was available in those days. And so what happened is along comes the Dutchman Leeuwenhoek, who invents the microscope in the 1700s. In the 1800s, the egg and the sperm are seen and the process of fertilization is discovered. And we finally see in the 20th century a more or less full, although obviously with more to be known, regarding the process by which, by the union of the contribution of the two parents, in a period of 24 hours, a new biological individual with all of the interior makeup of a human being is present and simply develops and forms and takes shape from that point forward. So that today, if Aquinas were alive, he would say there can be no question that the distinguishing point of existence is the beginning of human life at fertilization. And so this is the way science, theology, and philosophy can come together. But on the part of reason, there's the possibility of error. There is no error on the part of theology. And this is, I think, what bothered a lot of theologians, because we know that in a moment, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Yeah. So maybe it wasn't as the philosophers were saying. And I think today we understand that the Scripture, the science, and the philosophy are in agreement about when human life begins. It is those individuals who are, for their own philosophies, not true philosophy, for their own philosophies, are denying both the philosophy and the science. So this is, I think it's important to see this confluence of ideas. And theology, as I've noted, Father, make a unique contribution and has contributed a great deal to our understanding of these issues.
Definitely, and we know that all of these are leading us toward the truth, and God is a source of all truth, whether it's in science, philosophy, or theology. But there are those things that are beyond our limitations. So how can we speak about the ultimate creator of all things, God, and his inner life? We can discover that God exists, and he's the first cause of all things, as we've already talked about. But how can we know anything about his inner life unless he reveals it to us? And so that's theology. It's taking these premises already given to us by God, revealed to us, his divine revelation, where he reveals to us his inner life, that he is not a lonely God, but he is a communion of persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And in the fullness of time, he revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ, his Son. So that's something that affects our own understanding of the human community as well. That we're not just called to be isolated individuals, but we are called to a communion of persons. And in fact, heaven is the enjoyment of God, but also the communion of the saints. And then we could also speak about how it's revealed to us human dignity, that we're made in the image of God. is because of that understanding that Christian philosophy or Christian theology has brought that understanding to civilization. It's the Christian civilizations that eventually did away with infanticide and slavery because they understood that every person had a dignity given them by God. Why? Because they were made in the image and likeness of God.
It's interesting you should mention that because I had a course, you take a certain number of core courses, and so I took one in sociology when I was at Northwestern. And the professor, who is very noted in the field, has spent much of his career looking at issues of race and class and power. In fact, that was the name of the course. And one thing that struck me as a 19-year-old Catholic boy sitting in this secularized university, it started out as Methodist, like so many schools like Yale and Harvard, as religious, was him noting that there was quite a difference between the Catholic countries and the non-Catholic or the Protestant countries on this. Now, in the Catholic countries, certainly there was diminishment of the natives, the Indians and so on, and others. But they weren't said not to be persons, and there were no laws against marriage. There might be sort of social conventions that a rich man did not marry like an Indian woman or something like this, a native of whatever country it was. But yet marriages occurred, the church blessed them, and so on and so forth. Children came from them. And so much of Latin America is a mixed race people and culture. Whereas in North America, there was a certain amount of demonizing of minorities, obviously the Native Americans as well as Africans who had been brought over as slaves. And so an effort to theologically justify that. Whereas in the Catholic countries, that is not, there was the usual human faults and mistreatment of people, but that was not living by the principles of that culture. It was living by the weakness of man. But in the non-Catholic countries, you did see that effort at dehumanization. Intellectually, Noah, you can go wrong in trying to relate these three things together: theology, faith, science, philosophy. And the church actually looked at that in the 1800s. The First Vatican Council gave us some guidance as to what can go wrong, what can go right, obviously, and what ought to be done regarding the truth, but also what can go wrong.
A quote I'd like to start with is the Vatican I said, "One true God and Lord can be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason and by means of the things that are made." The church stated this at the time because there was a growth of something called fideism. Fideism didn't think that natural reason could know either anything true or certain things true, certain things like about morality, things with regard to things of faith, that there is a God, that God gives propositions, and that the propositions come from God. And the church said against this error that would be attacking human reason, no, this is false. Human reason has a power. It has a power to know the truth through natural things, at least a certain range of truths. Another thing that came up, we were all probably very familiar with this, is rationalism, by which it was asserted that everything that can be known by reason, and reason needs help of no one, God or anything like that. There's another error that came up, and we know it as materialism, which reduced people, not just minorities, but people, to being simply the atoms that they're made up of. And there's nothing else you need to know about the person except some sort of chemistry or physics of the body. And against that, the church asserted that no, materialism is wrong. Matter of fact, one could note that the Assumption of the Virgin was declared, by which we make it powerfully clear that persons are more than just the atoms in their body.
Well, and you look historically, eugenics and this kind of thing came up in Germany precisely because of the materialistic outlook regarding man.
Yeah. It's important to realize, and a little historical example here is, Israel had the true God because God came to Israel and spoke to Moses, and they set up worship, and they worshiped God the way God wanted. The Greeks asked questions about God but could never answer them, and they came up with philosophy. Eventually the two cultures met. And because the two cultures met, you had the growing of something wonderful, which became Western Europe. And eventually, because true worship comes from God, we could talk about the person. And not just Roman law that talked about law without the person being a person, but to understand, like you said, God became a man, and that was true at the moment in which the conception took place. And religion was able to raise questions about things that philosophy asked questions about but couldn't answer, because you need help to get some of these things done. The other thing I'd like to end with is Benedict here, in a quote that he gave to the Curia in 2006. He said, speaking to us presently, of course, it is a question of the attitude of the community of the faithful that we must adopt and have a conviction. On the one hand, we must oppose the dictatorship of the view that man is self-sufficient. He calls that positive reason, that excludes God from the life of the community, from public organizations, and thus deprives man of the criteria of judgment that God's presence gives us. The other one, he said, on the other hand, we must welcome the true accomplishments of the Enlightenment and the other things historical, where we realize that people are persons. He mentions human rights, especially the freedom of faith and its practice, that you cannot coerce to religion. These are important accomplishments that are made possible because reason works with the revelation of God given to us by the grace of God, so that we can go forward and have the wonderful many things that we have right now. Mm-hmm. One might want to read a science fiction book called The Canticle of Leibowitz, in which it's after the fact of a nuclear war that destroys practically all the earth. And he just gives us history after the fall of Rome in a sort of science fiction way, and talks about the church rather wonderfully and the questions it is able to raise to society, because God is real. And final example here is David's called to account by God, you know? Mm-hmm. And because God is real and says that man, though he wasn't a Jew, you can't do that to him. And God speaks. Religion must listen, science must listen, and philosophy must listen if the truth is at all valuable to us.
And the thing is, they must listen to each other as well, because they can't replace, theology cannot replace science. Mm-hmm. You mentioned fideism. It's not quite that air, but the effort to turn the Bible into a science book, yeah, although it says true things about the universe and obviously creation, salvation, history, those things are clearly there, is part of that air. We must realize that science, working according to its own principles, will discover the truth, even though science itself admits sort of the transient nature of its conclusions, because they're always capable of potentially of being falsified and being improved upon. Mm-hmm. So truth is somewhat fleeting in that sense, but yet you can come to a substantial agreement among scientists as to different things that are true. And it's that respect, I think, which the church has shown over time. And so we're going to talk in the next segment not only about the respect that the church has for science, but the ways in which the church and her faith, as well as her philosophers, who are largely the carriers of this long intellectual tradition, can help science and correct the errors and the excesses of judgment with respect to areas not truly part of the scientific method. We'll be back in a moment to do that.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces volta, cade Virgo, Ave Regina Angelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve.
Well, we're back, and as I noted at the end of the last segment, we want to have these three areas of knowledge: the philosophy, which is the knowledge as reason can discover regarding the ultimate causes of things. These can be the causes of the being of things or the natures of things. Those can also be studied on a natural level, on a material level, and science does this, the natural sciences. Of course, the human sciences, sociology and so on, just look at man and cultures and societies from that perspective as well. So any of those fields using the scientific method, our efforts to get at the material causes and states of things. And then, of course, obviously, theology with the knowledge revealed by God, the things that are known certainly. And so one of the areas where this comes up, I alluded to at the end of the last segment, and that is regarding the issues of the creation and so on. And we're not going to get into that here. There isn't a lot that can be said, frankly, of what the church has taught affirmatively, dogmatically. Obviously, the church asserts that at some point there were two human beings receiving their soul from God, and that from this all of the human race derived. It's quite a different view of things than the material view, which can justify eugenics, that one population of the human family has a different beginning or a distinct cause, and therefore could be subjugated or mistreated or marginalized. No, the church sees the unity of the Holy Family, of the whole human family there. And of course, the church sees God as the creator of everything, all matter and energy, as Einstein would put it, in the universe, without exactly saying what is done by God's direct and immediate act and what is done by his secondary causes, the laws and things that he puts into effect, or even perhaps even his angels. We don't know the role that these intelligent creatures had in forming the universe. But what the church doesn't do is try to tell science what conclusions it should have, whether it's about cosmology or particle physics or even biological evolution. And so the church has that as a suspended question that scientists can look at whether the body was formed from pre-existing human forms that were not human. So we're not trying to answer that question or say which way it should go. That's the church is waiting on the science, and it hasn't been demonstrated or proven, just exactly that. But what we do know, and the church tells us and philosophy tells us, is that the Spirit does not arise from that matter. Now, John Paul II, in discussing this in audiences in January of 1986, a general audience, and in an audience with the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996, a decade later, said two things which are important guidance for believers with regard to how to deal with these issues. John Paul said in 86, the theory of natural evolution, understood in a sense that does not exclude divine causality, is not in principle opposed to the truth about the creation of the visible world as presented in the book of Genesis. So the Pope is saying that in principle, it depends on what the exact conclusions scientists make. And a conclusion of scientists that the soul simply is the epiphenomena of matter would be a philosophically false conclusion, for starters, but also a theologically false conclusion. And it would be a scientist going beyond the bounds of natural science, since it can't address the question whether something like spirit exists. That's not an empirical question. So that was the warning the Pope was giving to regarding the evolution questions. And to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he said, it is by virtue of the spiritual soul the whole human person possesses such dignity, even in his body, that Pius XII stressed this essential point: if the human body takes its origin from pre-existing living matter, the spiritual soul is nonetheless immediately created by God, humani generis. Consequently, theories of evolution in accordance with the philosophies inspiring them, which consider the spirit as emerging from the forces of living matter as a mere epiphenomena of this matter, are incompatible with the truth about man. And he's saying they're philosophically incompatible, as I noted, and not just theological. One of the areas where this comes up again, this whole distinction between whether something is simply physical phenomena, epiphenomena coming out of the physical, or spiritual, is the whole question of the mind itself.
Right. There's an issue in science as in philosophy on the relationship between the brain and the mind. Materialists, among whom are many scientists and philosophers, assume or try to prove that the mind or human consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of the brain, that selfhood, free will, and subjectivity can be explained by neurological processes, that consciousness is an emergent property of brain cell activity. Now, they present arguments in favor of this theory. They note that there are personality changes or loss of memory due to head injury. MRI and PET scans show a correlation between brain cell activity and different mental states. But these show only that the mind doesn't work independently of the brain, not that the brain produces the mind. There are objections to this theory. There is no explanation for how thoughts arise from chemical processes. That's the basic objection. Also, there's no explanation for how activities all over the brain, millions of brain cells, unite in a single mental state, as in vision or a coherent sense of self. And third, how are we to explain free will if everything in consciousness is determined by cell activity? Raymond Tallis, a neurologist who was also an atheist, criticized the reduction of a human being to a brain with its neurological processes. He's particularly critical of what he calls Darwinitis, the same materialist view with an evolutionary slant. The brain is an evolved organ with an evolutionary purpose, according to this theory. That purpose is to pass on genes. Thus, the mind is an epiphenomenon of an organ whose primary purpose is to preserve and pass on its genetic line. Despite its evolutionary flourish, it faces the same basic objection as all materialist views. How can purely physical processes account for consciousness? Tallis quoted a biochemist who taught at both Cambridge and Oxford universities, J.B.S. Haldane, in Possible Worlds. It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of the atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically.
Yeah.
Hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Then Sir John Eccles, a neuroscientist who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1963, denied that the mind and brain are identical. In his view, the mind plays an active role in selecting and integrating brain cell activity, molding it into a unified whole. Conscious experiences are not just a reflection of brain's activities. If that were so, he wrote, our conscious cells would be no more than passive spectators of the performances carried out by the neuronal machinery of the brain. Our beliefs that we can really make decisions and that we have some control over our actions would be nothing but illusions. So there goes human responsibility.
It would be hard to explain how somebody can explain something to another person and all of a sudden they have an insight. You would think that it must mean that, wow, it's just a chemical reaction, that there's a chemical reaction out there that gives you an insight, say, into some subject.
A spark flew between brains.
So maybe we're all Platonists. All of that is preset in us. Father, the near-death experiences is something that's sort of akin to this, because that raises questions of how experiences seem to be separated from physical processes.
There's a recent book by a director of cardiology in the Netherlands. His name is Dr. Pim van Lommel, and he wrote a book called Consciousness Beyond Life. And it all started in 1969, when he was helping at a hospital, and he was helping a cardiology patient who was very disappointed that they had resuscitated him, because it had been such a joyful, light-giving, celestial music experience that he had, that he didn't want to come back. to this life. And so it got his interest piqued, and then when later books were written about this experience, he decided to ask some of his own cardiology patients. And to his surprise, he didn't expect this, 50 of them said that they had had near-death experiences. And so he actually did 10 years of research asking patients that had cardiac arrest, which means there's no blood flow, there's no oxygen to the brain, and within 15 seconds, the EEG, the brain activity, is zero. There's no activity. And so this 10 years of research, he came to certain conclusions. It wasn't the result of some medication they were on, because they didn't have a common medication. It wasn't the result of their psychological state, whether they were afraid or accepting of death or whatever faith they were. It wasn't based on any of these sort of material causes. There's something else. And what he brings out is that consciousness is something beyond just the physical brain. We think about a parent saying to a child, use your brain. And what that parent is saying is that you're bigger than just your material brain, but use that, to reason through things. And so that was his conclusions in his book, is that consciousness survives just the dissolution of the brain or the brain injury that a person may have.
I think there have been a number of books written on this subject, obviously, demonstrating that people do have these experiences. Obviously, speaking on the purely physical level, it's, I think, a significant data. The interpretation of it, of course, is something that would have to be done, just exactly what that means philosophically, theologically. But I think physical data seems to be clear that how do you have this degree of consciousness when there is no materiality functioning to support it? Well, I'm afraid we've sort of run out of time, and we wanted to talk a little bit about cosmology, some of the ideas behind the Big Bang, only to show that in addition to those scientists that don't attempt to fill in the gaps themselves and say, well, before this event we call the Big Bang, this was this way or that was that way, that would be philosophy. There are those scientists like Stephen Hawking and others, string theorists and so on, who would attempt to create out of whole cloth explanations that would, in a sense, do away with any causality or substitute a pure material causality. This is the kind of effort which is beyond the scope of scientific investigation. It can't be proved one way or the other that that's the case. So it's a word of caution, I think, to realize that although most scientists who are doing work in these fields are sincere and are guided and following the scientific method, there are others who are using materialistic presuppositions, essentially philosophical presuppositions, and allowing those to determine and to guide them, creating ideological solutions by creating ideas that are not capable of experimental investigation and confirmation. But anyway, we don't have time to say any more on that subject, but we'll be back with you with another roundtable next time. God bless.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve porta, ex mundo luces volta, cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, vale o vale decora, et pro nobis Christum exora.
Dignare me laudare te, Virgo sacrata.
Da mihi virtutem contra hostes tuos.
Oremus, concede misericors Deus fragilitate nos